Firebase Coral, Bien Hoa Province, South Vietnam. May 12, 1968, 2:47 a.m. Captain John Hartley of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division stared through his night vision scope at the Australian firebase 3 kilometers west. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Where the Australians should have bunkers, he saw, nothing. Where defensive wires should gleam in the moonlight, there was only darkness. Where floodlights should illuminate kill zones, the jungle pressed close to their position. Jesus Christ, he muttered to his radio man. Those crazy Aussies are going to get themselves wiped out. The American firebase around Hartley represented the pinnacle of defensive engineering. 3 layers of concertina wire extending 50 meters out. Claymore mines every 5 meters, interlocking fields of fire from reinforced bunkers, floodlights that could turn night into day, and a cleared perimeter stretching 200 meters in every direction. A fortress, impregnable. The Australian task force base at Nui Dat looked, by American standards, suicidal. What Captain Hartley didn't know, what most American commanders refused to believe, was that by May 1968, Australian bases were experiencing 1/10 the perimeter attacks of comparable American positions. While U.S. fire bases fought off nightly probes and periodic major assaults, the Australians slept soundly. And when the Viet Cong did attack Australian positions, they died in disproportionate numbers, often without breaching the perimeter at all. The wire wasn't missing. The defenses weren't absent. The Australians had simply learned something fundamental about jungle warfare that the Americans, despite their overwhelming firepower and engineering capability, never fully grasped. In Vietnam, the best defense wasn't building a fortress. It was making sure the enemy never wanted to attack in the first place. When the first Australian advisors arrived in South Vietnam in 1962, American commanders welcomed them with the patronizing warmth reserved for junior partners. The Australians, after all, were a small force from a middle-sized power. What could they possibly teach the arsenal of democracy? The Australians are keen, but they're working with limited resources, wrote Colonel Samuel Wilson, senior advisor in the 3rd Corps, in a 1963 memo. Their unconventional approach to base defense reflects capability constraints rather than tactical wisdom. This assessment reflected deep-rooted American military philosophy. U.S. doctrine, refined in World War II and Korea, emphasized establishing secure rear areas from which to project force. Bases were sanctuaries, fortified zones where soldiers could rest, rearm, and reorganize without threat. The bigger the perimeter, the more wire, the more bunkers, the safer the base. It was logical, proven, and backed by the industrial might that had won 2 world wars. Major General William C. Westmoreland, commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, made this doctrine explicit in his 1965 operational directive. All U.S. installations will maintain defensive perimeters consistent with force protection requirements. Perimeter defenses will include cleared fields of fire extending minimum 200 meters, multi-layer wire obstacles, illumination capability, and hardened defensive positions. The directive ran to 47 pages and included precise specifications for everything from bunker construction to mine placement to wire configuration. It represented the American way of war: systematize, standardize, fortify. When Brigadier Oliver David Jackson arrived to command the 1st Australian Task Force in 1966, he read Westmoreland's directive and set it aside. "This isn't Malaya," he told his staff, "but it's not Normandy either." Jackson had spent 3 years fighting communist insurgents in the Malayan emergency. He'd learned lessons there that contradicted everything in Westmoreland's manual. American officers who visited the Australian base at Nui Dat were shocked. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton III, grandson of the famous general, submitted a concerned report after an August 1966 inspection. Australian defensive preparations are dangerously inadequate. Perimeter wire is minimal or absent in some sectors. Cleared fields of fire extend barely 50 meters. Bunker construction is substandard by U.S. specifications. I strongly recommend Australian forces be integrated into properly fortified U.S. installations for their own protection. The report reflected widespread American belief that the Australians were either too poor or too naive to defend themselves properly. "They're brave as hell," one American battalion commander said. "But they're going to learn the hard way that courage doesn't stop mortars." What the Americans didn't understand was that the Australians weren't failing to build proper defenses. They were deliberately choosing not to, and they had very specific reasons why. Sergeant Major Jack Bomber Pierce, a veteran of Malaya, explained it to confused American visitors. "You blokes build yourself a castle and dare Charlie to come get you. Then you're surprised when he does. We learned in Malaya that if you want to sleep safe at night, you make sure Charlie doesn't know where you are, can't get close enough to look, and gets dead if he tries." The Americans smiled politely and returned to their fortresses. The Australians continued sleeping without wire. The Australian approach to base defense didn't emerge from doctrine manuals. It was forged in the brutal counterinsurgency campaign against communist terrorists in Malaya from 1948 to 1960. British and Australian forces faced an enemy that moved like ghosts through triple canopy jungle, struck without warning, and vanished before conventional forces could respond. Early British attempts to build fortified bases and conduct sweeps from these positions failed spectacularly. The communist Malayan Races Liberation Army simply watched the bases, learned patrol patterns, and struck at times and places of their choosing. The breakthrough came when British Lieutenant Colonel Walter Walker, later joined by Australian commanders like Brigadier Sir Reginald Pollard, revolutionized jungle warfare doctrine. Walker's insight was simple but revolutionary. The jungle is neutral. It favors whoever knows it better. Instead of clearing fields of fire and building obvious fortifications, Walker's forces learned to make the jungle itself their defense. Bases were positioned on naturally defensive terrain. Approaches were left vegetated but saturated with small ambush patrols. The perimeter wasn't a line. It was a zone, often extending several kilometers, where any enemy movement met silent, violent response. Most critically, Walker emphasized what he called aggressive defense. The best way to protect a base wasn't to wait behind wire, but to dominate the surrounding terrain through constant patrolling, ambushes, and intelligence gathering. "If you control the jungle for 5 kilometers around your base," Walker wrote, "you don't need wire. If you don't control it, wire won't save you." Australian officers absorbed these lessons thoroughly. When Australia committed the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, to South Vietnam in 1965, they brought Malayan doctrine with them. The contrast with American practice was immediate and stark. Major Harry Smith, who would later command at the Battle of Long Tan, described his first reaction to American Firebase design. "I looked at these enormous bases, wire everywhere, bunkers, lights, cleared ground extending to the horizon, and thought, bloody hell, you might as well paint a target on it." Every VC in the province could see exactly where to aim their mortars. The Australian Task Force base at Nui Dat, established in June 1966, reflected radically different thinking. Situated on a low hill with good drainage and natural approaches that channeled attackers, the base had minimal wire, and in some sectors, none at all. Instead of clearing 200 meters around the perimeter, the Australians maintained jungle vegetation right up to within 50 meters. Defensive positions were carefully concealed rather than obvious bunkers. "Our wire is 5 kilometers out," explained Brigadier Jackson, "and it's made of men, not steel." What Jackson meant was that Australian doctrine emphasized dominating the surrounding terrain through aggressive, constant patrolling. While Americans conducted daytime sweeps from fire bases and returned to safety before dark, Australians lived in the jungle. Patrols moved silently through terrain they'd studied meticulously. They established ambush positions along every likely approach. They watched trails, recorded patterns, and built an intelligence picture of enemy movement. Captain Robert O'Neill, an Australian infantry officer and Rhodes Scholar, who would later become an eminent military historian, described the philosophy. American fire bases were designed on the principle of maximum firepower from a static position. The theory was that if the enemy attacked, you'd kill him with overwhelming fire. Australian bases were designed on the principle that the enemy would never get close enough to attack because we'd kill him well before he reached the perimeter. It's the difference between reactive and proactive defense. The technical differences were equally stark. American bunkers were reinforced with sandbags, timber, and sometimes steel, obvious hardened positions. Australian defensive positions were built into natural terrain features, camouflaged, and designed to be nearly invisible. "If you can see a bunker," instructed Sergeant Major Pierce, "you can kill it. Charlie's got mortars, too." American cleared fields of fire created obvious kill zones, but they also telegraphed exact defensive positions and made adjustment of indirect fire simple. Australian approaches left vegetated, concealed defensive positions, and made enemy fire control nearly impossible. More critically, the vegetation forced attackers to move close before assaulting, where they entered the killing zone of carefully positioned ambushes. The Australians also rejected American reliance on illumination. U.S. bases used floodlights and flares to turn night into day, believing superior firepower in illuminated conditions would overwhelm attackers. Australians considered this madness. "The moment you light up your position," explained Lieutenant Dave Sabin, "you're blind. Everything outside the light is invisible. Meanwhile, Charlie can see you perfectly. You've just given him free target practice." Instead, Australian bases remained dark. Defenders used night vision scopes sparingly and relied on sound discipline, pre-registered artillery concentrations, and intimate knowledge of terrain to engage targets. Most critically, they positioned listening posts and ambushes well forward of the perimeter. Any attack would hit these positions first, in darkness, where Australian soldiers had every advantage. By late 1966, the two defense philosophies coexisted in Phuoc Tuy province. American fire bases blazed with light at night, visible from kilometers away. The Australian base at Nui Dat remained dark, almost invisible in the jungle. American positions bristled with obvious fortifications. Australian positions seemed almost undefended. The Viet Cong were about to teach the Americans which approach worked better. Firebase Gold, Long Con Province, October 22, 1966, 11:30 p.m. The 274th Viet Cong Regiment had been watching the American firebase for 3 days. Planning Officer Nguyen Van Tao studied the position through binoculars from a tree line 800 meters distant. The American defenses were, by VC standards, laughably predictable. 3 rows of wire, 50 meters of cleared ground, bunkers every 20 meters. Tao briefed his company commanders. "Floodlights will activate when we hit the wire. Their mortars are here and here." He pointed to obvious mortar pits. "We suppress those first. Artillery is at the northeast corner. We avoid that sector. Once we breach the wire, their defenses collapse inward. We'll be inside before they can organize." Tao had planned similar attacks on 7 American fire bases. 4 had succeeded in penetrating the perimeter. 2 had been repulsed with heavy VC casualties, but they'd learned from each failure. American bases were powerful but predictable. The defenses never changed. Approaches were obvious. Timing was everything. Hit fast, breach the wire, exploit the confusion. Firebase Gold was a textbook American position. 300 soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division, surrounded by elaborate defenses that had taken 2 weeks to construct. Defensive planning followed Westmoreland's directive to the letter. The Americans considered themselves secure. At 2:15 a.m., the 274th Regiment attacked. Within 7 minutes, they'd suppressed the mortar pits with RPG fire, cut lanes through the wire with Bangalore torpedoes, and pushed assault teams through 2 breach points. By 2:30 a.m., Viet Cong soldiers were fighting inside the Firebase perimeter. The battle raged until dawn, when helicopter gunships forced the VC to withdraw. 18 Americans died. The Firebase was overrun for nearly 4 hours. The same week, the 274th Regiment's reconnaissance element began studying the Australian base at Nui Dat, 40 kilometers south. What they found confused them. Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Thanh Duan, leading the reconnaissance, reported back with frustration. The Australian base is not like the Americans. We cannot observe their defenses properly. When we try to get close, our scouts disappear. 3 men went to study the eastern approach. None returned. We hear nothing. No shots. They simply vanish. What was happening was simple. Australian ambush patrols were killing VC scouts silently, efficiently, and constantly, while American fire bases allowed enemy reconnaissance teams to observe from safe distances. Australian patrols owned the jungle for 5 kilometers around Nui Dat. Any VC movement in that zone met immediate, lethal response. Corporal Jack Kirby of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, described a typical patrol. We'd move into position just before dusk, maybe 800 meters from base. Complete silence. No smoking, no talking, nothing. Then we'd wait. Charlie had to know where we were to attack us, so he'd send scouts. We'd hear them coming. They're good, but not good enough. When they got close, we'd take them. Knife, garrote, or if necessary, single shots. Then drag the body back into the jungle and wait for the next one. The VC reconnaissance of Nui Dat turned into a nightmare. Over 3 weeks in November 1966, the 274th Regiment lost 23 scouts trying to observe Australian defenses. They never recovered a single body. They never heard shots. The scouts simply disappeared into the jungle and never returned. We cannot plan an attack without reconnaissance, Lieutenant Schwan reported. We cannot conduct reconnaissance without losing men. The Australians fight like we do. Silent, invisible, patient. This is not like fighting the Americans. When the 274th Regiment finally attempted a probe of Australian positions on December 8, 1966, the result was catastrophic. A reinforced VC company, 140 men, moved toward Nui Dat's southwestern perimeter at 3:00 a.m. They never reached the wire. Australian listening posts detected movement at 2,800 meters. Artillery concentrations, pre-registered on every likely approach, began falling on the VC formation before they realized they'd been detected. When survivors attempted to withdraw, they ran into ambush positions the Australians had occupied 2 hours earlier. By dawn, 67 Viet Cong bodies were counted. Not a single Australian soldier had been wounded. The VC never came within 400 meters of the actual base perimeter. We attacked a fortress we could not see, one captured VC soldier said during interrogation. We thought we were approaching the Australian wire. Then the shells came from everywhere. When we ran, they were waiting. How did they know we were coming? The answer was both simple and profound. The Australians knew because they owned the terrain. Patient observation, constant patrolling, detailed terrain knowledge, and aggressive ambush tactics meant that any enemy approach was detected, tracked, and engaged long before reaching the base itself. The perimeter wasn't wire. It was a 360-degree zone of Australian-controlled jungle. The contrast became stark during the Tet Offensive of January 1968. Across South Vietnam, Viet Cong and NVA forces launched coordinated attacks on military bases, cities, and strategic positions. American firebases, despite their elaborate fortifications, came under heavy assault. Many were penetrated. Some were temporarily overrun. The fighting was intense and costly. Firebase Patricia, Long Binh Province, January 31, 1968, 3:30 a.m. The 271st NVA Regiment hit the American position with everything they had: mortars, rockets, sappers, and infantry assault. The attack followed the standard pattern: suppress defensive fires, breach the wire, exploit gaps. Despite elaborate defenses, the NVA achieved 2 significant breaches and fought inside the perimeter for 6 hours. 23 Americans died before helicopter gunships and reinforcements drove the attackers off. That same morning, the 274th VC Regiment, under direct orders from COSVN, Central Office for South Vietnam, was supposed to attack the Australian base at Nui Dat as part of the coordinated Tet assault. They didn't. We received the order, a VC regimental commander later told Australian interrogators, but we could not execute. To attack the Australians requires 2 weeks of reconnaissance and detailed planning. We did not have time. To attack without reconnaissance would be suicide. Instead, the 274th Regiment diverted to attack the provincial capital of Ba Ria, where they were decimated by American and South Vietnamese forces. They never seriously threatened Nui Dat. Major General Tim Vincent, who commanded the Australian task force from 1967-1968, later wrote, "During Tet, every major American base in the 3rd Corps came under attack. We received probes, some mortar fire, nothing serious. Not because we were lucky, because we'd made ourselves a target that required too much effort and offered too little chance of success. The VC chose easier targets." The statistics from 1967-1968 told the story. American fire bases in Phu Oc Tuy and Long Con provinces experienced an average of 14 perimeter attacks per year, with 3 to 4 resulting in breaches. The Australian base at Nui Dat experienced 2 serious probes, 0 breaches, and consistently inflicted casualty ratios exceeding 25.1 when engaged. Captain Brian McFarlane, an American liaison officer attached to the Australian task force, filed a detailed report in March 1968 that should have revolutionized American defensive doctrine. Australian casualty rates from base defense are 1/10 those of comparable U.S. positions. Their approach requires fewer soldiers dedicated to static defense, allowing more troops for offensive operations. Most critically, their method disrupts enemy operational planning by denying reconnaissance and creating defensive uncertainty. I recommend immediate study and potential adoption of Australian defensive methods. The report was filed and forgotten. American commanders continued building fortresses. The Australians continued sleeping without wire. By mid-1968, the strategic implications of Australian defensive philosophy extended far beyond base security. The Americans were locked into a pattern: build elaborate fire bases, defend them with significant forces, conduct daytime operations, return to base before dark. 50% of American combat power was tied to static defense. The Australians operated differently. Because their bases required minimal dedicated defense forces, relying instead on aggressive patrolling and terrain domination, they could deploy 75 to 80% of available combat power offensively. An Australian battalion of 800 men might have 600 in the field at any given time. A comparable American battalion of 900 might have 400 actually patrolling, with the rest manning base defenses, mortar pits, and guard towers. "We're not defending a base," explained Brigadier Ronald Hughes, who commanded the task force in 1968. "We're controlling an area. The base happens to be in that area, but it's not the center of our attention. The jungle is. When you control the jungle, you don't need wire." This philosophy generated extraordinary results. Australian small unit actions routinely achieved contact success rates exceeding 80%, meaning when Australians went looking for the enemy, they found them. American success rates averaged 35 to 40%. The difference wasn't courage or individual soldier quality. It was operational method. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Kahn, commanding the 7th Battalion, RAR, described a typical week in September 1968. "We ran 43 patrols, made contact 14 times, killed 37 confirmed VC without losing a man. Every contact was on our terms. We found them, we chose the moment, we controlled the engagement. Meanwhile, our base was essentially unmanned except for essential personnel. No attacks, no probes, no concern." The Viet Cong adapted, but not in ways that overcame Australian advantages. Unable to attack bases directly, they attempted to ambush Australian patrols. This worked occasionally against American units. Catch them on a trail, hit fast, disengage before artillery arrived. Against Australian patrols, it rarely succeeded. "The Australians don't use trails," explained Nguyen Van Hung, a former VC Company commander captured in 1969. "They move through the thickest jungle, very slowly, very quietly. When they stop, they vanish. You can be 5 meters from an Australian patrol and not know they're there. Then when you move, they kill you. Fighting the Australians is like fighting ghosts. We learned to avoid areas where they operated." This last point revealed the ultimate success of Australian methods. By late 1968, VC units were avoiding Australian operational areas when possible. Areas patrolled by Australian battalions showed significantly reduced enemy activity compared to adjacent American areas. The Australians achieved the counterinsurgency holy grail. They'd made their operational area too dangerous for the enemy to operate freely. American units, despite superior firepower and more elaborate bases, couldn't replicate this effect. Viet Cong continued operating aggressively in American areas, attacking firebases, ambushing patrols, and maintaining presence. The fortresses weren't working. Some American officers recognized the problem. Major General Julian Ewell, commanding the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta, visited Australian units multiple times in 1968-69 and attempted to implement elements of their doctrine. "The Australians have figured out something we're missing," he told his staff. "We need to stop building castles and start controlling ground." Ewell's division adopted some Australian methods: increased patrolling, aggressive ambushes, reduced reliance on firebases. Results improved notably. In his 6-month command period, the 9th Division's kill ratio improved from 8.1 to 15:1, and firebase attacks decreased by 40%. But the changes never spread beyond his division. Macy v. Doctrine remained unchanged. The fundamental resistance came from cultural and logistical differences. Americans had the engineering capacity to build elaborate bases quickly, so they did. They had massive firepower advantages, so they leveraged them through static positions. They had overwhelming air support, so they built bases where helicopters could easily access. All of this was logical within American operational frameworks. What they couldn't replicate was the Australian patience. The emphasis on fieldcraft over firepower, the willingness to move slowly and silently, rather than ride helicopters to contact. American units rotated individual soldiers in and out constantly. A 12-month tour meant units never developed the collective terrain knowledge and patrol cohesion that Australian battalions achieved. "You can't teach this in 12 months, said Sergeant Major Pierce, watching an American unit practice patrol techniques. Half these blokes will be gone in 6 months, replaced by new guys who have to learn everything again. We keep units together, rotate entire battalions. When a battalion goes into the field, they've worked together for 18 months. They know each other, trust each other, move like one organism. That's what you need in the jungle. The NVA and VC noticed the difference and exploited it ruthlessly. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Hu An, NVA 304th Division, explained in his post-war memoir, "We studied each battalion carefully. American units were dangerous with firepower, but predictable in movement. They used helicopters extensively, operated from bases, returned before dark. We learned their patterns and avoided or ambushed accordingly. Australian units were different. Small patrols, constant movement, night operations, unpredictable timing. We avoided them when possible because engaging them meant heavy losses with little gain. By 1969, this behavioral difference had become statistically measurable. Australian operational areas showed 35 to 40% less VC activity than comparable American areas. Where American firebases averaged 8 to 10 security incidents monthly, probes, mortar attacks, sapper attempts, Australian bases averaged 1-2. When the Australians did experience attacks, casualty ratios consistently exceeded 20.1 in their favor. The Australian task force rotated home in 1972, having sustained 521 killed in action over 7 years, a rate significantly lower than comparable American units despite aggressive operations. More remarkably, only 17 Australians died in base defense situations. The fortresses without wire had proven far safer than American fortifications bristling with defensive systems. The Australian defensive philosophy reached its highest validation during the period between September 1969 and March 1970, when the Australian Task Force conducted Operation Overlord, the largest Australian operation of the war. During this 6-month period, Australian forces maintained forward patrol bases with virtually no static defenses, while simultaneously conducting aggressive operations throughout Phuoc Tuy Province. Fire Support Patrol Bases, FSPBs, the Australian equivalent of American fire bases, were established and abandoned weekly. They featured minimal wire, no permanent fortifications, and defensive plans built entirely around aggressive patrolling of surrounding terrain. FSPB Anderson, established October 15, 1969, typified the approach. The base housed 350 Australian soldiers plus artillery. By American standards, it was absurdly vulnerable. Single-strand wire in some sectors, cleared fields of fire extending only 40 meters, defensive bunkers that were barely reinforced. An American engineer officer who visited called it an invitation to disaster. The base operated for 6 weeks without a single serious attack. Surrounding terrain crawled with Australian patrols, ambushes every night on all approaches, listening posts up to 1,500 meters out, constant movement and reconnaissance. When the base relocated on November 28th, engineers estimated a properly equipped VC battalion could have overrun it within 2 hours if they'd achieved tactical surprise. They never got the chance. Australian patrols killed 47 VC in the 6-week period, all in small contacts well away from the base perimeter. The VC never assembled the reconnaissance data necessary to plan an assault. "We knew they were watching," said Captain Harry Honner, whose company provided base security. "We knew they were trying to figure out our defenses, so we made sure they never got close enough to see anything. Every time they sent scouts, we killed them. After a while, they stopped trying." The cumulative statistics from Operation Overlord demonstrated the efficiency of Australian methods. Australian combat power deployed offensively, 73%. Comparable American operations, 48%. Australian casualties from base defense, 4, all wounded, none killed. Enemy casualties attempting to approach Australian bases, 183 confirmed killed. Successful enemy penetrations of Australian perimeters. 0. Combat effectiveness ratio. Enemy killed per friendly casualty. 26.1. Compare this to American operations in the same region during the same period. 52% of forces tied to static defense. 89 Americans killed in Firebase defense actions. 12 perimeter breaches. Overall combat ratio of 11.1. The validation extended beyond statistics. By late 1969, captured documents showed that VC local forces and NVA regiments had explicit orders regarding Australian positions. A captured operations order from the D445 VC Battalion stated, "Avoid direct engagement with Australian forces when possible. If contact is unavoidable, break contact immediately. Do not attempt reconnaissance of Australian base areas without authorization from regimental level." This directive, treating engagement with a force 1/20th the size of American deployments as requiring special authorization, represented the ultimate success of Australian defensive doctrine. They'd made themselves too difficult, too dangerous, and too unpredictable to be worth attacking. Major General A.L. MacDonald, the last commander of the Australian Task Force, reflected in 1971. "We never built a fortress because we understood that in counterinsurgency, the fortress is a target and a trap. You concentrate your force, advertise your position, tie yourself to one piece of ground. Meanwhile, the enemy is everywhere you're not. We chose instead to be everywhere, to own the ground, to make the jungle ours. The base was just where we kept our supplies. Our real defensive perimeter was measured in kilometers, not meters, and it was made of soldiers, not wire." The long-term impact extended well beyond Vietnam. Australian defensive doctrine, codified as mobile defense in depth, influenced counterinsurgency operations in subsequent conflicts. British forces in Northern Ireland adopted elements of Australian patrolling methods. American special forces studying Vietnam lessons paid particular attention to Australian techniques. By the time of Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. doctrine had shifted significantly away from the fortress mentality, emphasizing instead patrol bases, area security, and aggressive patrolling, essentially rediscovering what the Australians had proven in Vietnam. Firebase Coral, Bien Hoa Province, May 13, 1968, dawn. Captain John Hartley watched the sun rise over the Australian position he'd worried about the night before. His Firebase had repelled 3 probes during the night. 2 Americans were dead, 7 wounded. The elaborate defenses had held, but the Viet Cong had gotten close enough to throw satchel charges at bunkers before withdrawing. The Australian Firebase 3 kilometers west reported 0 contact. They'd slept through the night undisturbed. Hartley never learned that Australian patrols had killed 4 VC scouts 2 kilometers from their base that same evening, disrupting the reconnaissance necessary for a coordinated attack. The lesson the Australians taught, and that the American command structure largely ignored, was fundamental. In jungle warfare, static defense is vulnerability. The illusion of security created by wire, bunkers, and cleared fields of fire was exactly that, an illusion. Real security came from owning the terrain, understanding the environment, and making the enemy pay such a high price for reconnaissance that attacks became impossible. "We built fortresses in Vietnam," wrote Major General Paul Gorman, who served 3 tours in Vietnam and later commanded the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. "We surrounded ourselves with wire and lights and fields of fire, and we thought we were safe." Meanwhile, a small Australian task force with minimal defenses achieved better security through superior fieldcraft and tactical aggression. They understood what we didn't. In counterinsurgency, the best defense is making the enemy afraid to attack. Not because you're too strong, but because he can't figure out where you are, how you'll respond, or whether his scouts will survive long enough to report back. The Australian approach required capabilities that American forces, despite their overwhelming resources, struggled to replicate. Unit cohesion, built over years rather than months. Patience to move slowly and silently through hostile terrain, cultural willingness to live in discomfort rather than behind wire, and tactical philosophy that prioritized preventing attacks over repelling them. Post-war Vietnamese accounts confirmed the effectiveness. General Tran Van Tra, who commanded VC forces in the southern region, wrote in his memoir, "Australian units operated in ways that confused and frustrated our forces. They moved like we did, fought like we did, controlled terrain like we did. Attacking their positions required resources and time we couldn't afford. We learned to avoid them and focus on easier targets." That last phrase captures the ultimate success. The Australians made themselves difficult enough that the enemy chose not to fight them. They achieved what every military force dreams of, winning by not fighting. The wire wasn't missing from Australian bases. The defenses weren't absent. They'd simply learned what no amount of engineering could replicate. The jungle itself, properly used, was the best defense. And soldiers who owned the jungle didn't need wire to sleep safely.